Okay, well, thank you very much for having me. My name is Dr. Jack Hunter, and I'm delighted to be here presenting for you. I'm just sorry that I can't be there with you live and in person. Anyway, I'll just get started because I've got quite a few things that I want to get through here. So this is the title of my presentation, Of Minds, Monsters, and Miscommunication, Reflections on Encounters with Real Monsters. And these are the things that I want to talk about. First of all, I'm going to talk a little bit about what definitions of monsters and what they are, and give some examples of some real life experiences with monsters. Then we'll take a little bit of time to think about the possibility of other kinds of minds in nature and how these monsters might fit into that. And then we'll end up with the issue of communication, which is a fundamental theme that runs through all sorts of different kinds of encounters with monsters, real and imaginary. And then we'll end with a few conclusions. Okay, so we'll begin with monsters. Um, Timothy Beale, who wrote this great book, Religion and Its Monsters, points out that etymologically the term monster derives from the Latin word monstrum, related to the verb monstrare, to show or to reveal, and monere, to warn or portend. So at its very sort of definitional level, the idea of a monster is bound up with a sort of a revelation or a form of communication, really, a warning, a message of some kind. He goes on to say that the monstrum was a message that breaks into this world from the realm of the divine. Okay, so monsters really were a kind of a bridge between the realm of the divine, of the spiritual or the spirits, and the mundane world of human beings. Okay, so monsters are messages. Um, there has been, as you probably well know, in recent years, um, a flourishing of monster theory. Um, it's important to point out that for the most part, in this kind of monster theory, the theorists are dealing with literary monsters, so fictional monsters or perhaps mythical monsters. Jeffrey Weinstock says, whether the monstrous comes to us or we conjure it up, monstrosity is a loose and flexible epistemological category that allows us a space to define that which complicates or seems to resist definition. Okay, so monsters are understood as this kind of anomalous category into which we can put things that we don't quite understand or which don't make sense to us, things that resist neat definition. And then he goes on to say that contemporary monster theory is dealing with monsters as these sort of literary creations. He says monsters from this perspective remain texts in need of interpretation. However, they are messages originating from human beings rather than gods. Put concisely, contemporary monster theory tends to explore monsters rather than monsters. So this is an interesting point because he's saying that, monster theory deals with these literary creations. But what I'm actually interested in is when people have experiences of their own which they believe to be true, which in folklore we might refer to as memorets rather than literature. Okay, so narratives that are believed to be true, where people encounter these things that they describe as monsters. So I'm actually interested in real monsters, um, not literary monsters, but monsters that people have experienced or claim to have experienced. Okay, I suppose we could say this is another literary tradition of monster encounter narratives. These kinds of monsters, I think we could take quite a broad perspective of them. In the literature or the language of Fortean studies, which I'm very interested in, these might be referred to as high strangeness creatures, creatures that have multiple baffling components and are very difficult to pin down, things that we might put into that category of monsters. This is a quote from John Keel, who was a writer in that Fortean tradition, and he wrote about all sorts of different kinds of monsters. He gives us a nice term to refer to them as the unbelievables. He says they're phantoms that come crashing out of the bushes late at night. They seem to be part of something else, something sinister and even hostile to us. This nuclear phenomenon has always existed on this planet and has taken many forms. Some of the unbelievables may have been transmogrifications or disguises for the central phenomenon. They are not real or physical in the usual sense of those terms, but they are real enough while they last. They are paraphysical and can assume the forms of one-eyed giants stepping out of magnificent flying machines, or long-fingered Orientals driving around in black Cadillacs, which can melt into the air. So he's talking there about the men in black, these mysterious figures who are often encountered by people who've had UFO experiences and they're intimidated by them. But anyway, what he's saying is there's this whole spectrum of different kinds of unbelievable beings that people claim to have had genuine encounters with. So these are the kinds of things that I'm interested in. For many, they might be the kinds of experiences that go beyond their boggle threshold. The historian of psychical research, Rennie Haynes, coined this term boggle threshold to refer to the kind of limits of what we can accept in terms of weirdness. And some people from some disciplines have high levels of weirdness that they can accept, like maybe me, an anthropologist, or someone who does religious studies, whereas some are perhaps from sort of mainstream psychology or maybe something like physics would have a much more rigid boggle threshold, and there'll be things that they just can't accept to be true, perhaps like monsters. So I'm interested in trying to step beyond these kinds of boggle thresholds and think about these very weird kinds of monster encounters that people have reported and they believe to be true. Okay, so here's one which I think is both very, very strange and also which encapsulates a lot of the themes that I'm interested in, especially to do with different minds and issues to do with attempted communication across this kind of chasm of minds. So this is the story of Sam the Sandown Clown. Some of you might have heard of this before, and if not, I'll give you a brief overview and you can check it out. The story basically goes, in the summer of 1973, there was a girl and her friend, and they were playing together on the Isle of Wight, an island in the British Isles. And they were playing not far from Sandown Airport. Okay, so a small airport on a small island. They heard this weird wailing sound that's almost like an ambulance siren, is how they described it. And it's this sound, this anomalous sound that kind of initiates this experience. It kicks the whole thing off. Children follow the sound. They cross over a small wooden bridge. They have to cross over a stream, which has these kind of almost like fairy tale-like characteristics. And they see coming out from a bridge underneath, coming out from the stream underneath the bridge, a blue hand, gloved hand, reaches up. And again, there are these kind of Billy Goat Scruff, troll under the bridge connotations here. They see this figure emerging, and it's clutching a red book. And just on this idea of communication here, this red book is the first sort of hint of communication. It drops the book into the water. Okay, so that if you drop a book into the water, the communication would be garbled before retrieving it and moving away. And it enters into this metallic looking hut that's positioned nearby. And this is part of the reason why this story gets lumped into the kind of UFO encounter kind of category. This metallic hut, which could perhaps be some kind of landed flying saucer. The being moved along with a very strange hopping motion, with knees raised high. So it has this weird way of walking, perhaps like almost mechanical or puppet-like. And we don't have time to go into it now, but this is a kind of an interesting common thread that runs throughout all sorts of different kinds of monster encounters. They move very differently to us. According to the children, the entity was about 7 feet tall. It had no neck. It wore a yellow pointed hat. And pointed hats are interesting, folklorically. And it had these wooden-looking antennae protruding from it. This is interesting because it defies our expectations. We would think of antenna as metallic and technological, but these ones are made of wood. And he's also wearing a green tunic, which is actually a hallmark of many kinds of fairy encounters. Fairies are often seen wearing very old green clothing. They described the face of the creature. They said the face had triangular markings for eyes, a brown square of a nose, and motionless yellow lips. Other round markings were on his paper white cheeks, and a fringe of red hair fell onto his forehead. So he kind of has this depiction of almost of a clown or perhaps a robot, somewhere between a robot and a clown. And wooden slats protruded from his sleeves and from below his white trouser, which gives us the impression perhaps of a scarecrow or something like that, something that's been supported by wooden slats. So it's an encounter that mashes together all of these different features. And then we start to get into the communication element of it. Um, the entity has got this kind of microphone with it. It's almost like a small microphone and a speaker, and it uses this to communicate. Initially, the entity tried to communicate through the written word, with this book, and it introduced itself first of all in writing, explaining, "Hello, and I am all colors Sam." Okay, so it wrote this out for the children to read. But they described that it was in sort of grammatically jumbled writing. It was in handwriting. It was quite difficult to read. So he begins to use this microphone to communicate. But its lips don't appear to move when it's talking. Okay, so it holds this microphone up and it talks to them. Because of his strange white features, the children asked if he was really a man, and the answer was a chuckled no. They also asked if he was a ghost, which I think is a good question. The vague reply was, well, no, not really, but I am in an odd sort of way. What are you then? They continued, but only obtained the answer, you know, and no further explanation. He also said he had no name. This is all contradictory because he'd given his name as All Colours Sam earlier on. The entity went on to explain that there were others like him and that they were frightened of people, scared that they might be hurt by them. So you get this sort of almost fairy kind of imagery emerging here. The entity invited the children to its metallic hut, which had two floors, was decorated with wallpaper, and had wooden furniture inside. Okay, so it totally defies our expectations. Is this a kind of like a fairy cottage, or is it a UFO flying saucer landed? The entity told the children that he ate berries collected in the late afternoon and cleaned water from the stream to drink. Okay, so much fairiness going on there as well. The children spoke with the entity for about half an hour and were entertained with magic tricks before finally saying goodbye and running back home. And as with all of these kinds of encounter experiences, bizarre experiences like this, there's no real kind of resolution or conclusion to them. They just kind of fizzle out. And when the children bring their parents back to see if they can find this entity when they get back, there's nothing there. Okay, so the field is totally empty. There's no metallic hut. There's no Sam the Sandown Clown. Okay, so he's a very strange entity. The children gave this story, this narrative, they believed it to be true. Um, and it has these interesting themes of other than human beings, I suppose we could call Sam the Sandown Clown, and this kind of garbled communication that doesn't always succeed. So I'm just going to give a couple of other examples of monsters in inverted commas. This one is an account that was given to me by a student of mine a couple of years ago. He said, I was around 7 years old when my cousin was staying over for the night. My bed was positioned to the right of the window in my bedroom and the curtains were drawn. My cousin was reading. A strange, deep-toned voice with a kind of distorted resonance sounded from the window, capturing both our attention. My cousin told me not to go. I was too curious and slowly walked towards the window before opening the curtains. In the center of the window was a face of light. The bright light seemed to be pulsating inside of the face. It was large enough to engulf the entire center of the window. The mouth began moving and the deep, vibrating, muffled voice started to speak. I was unable to understand most of it and was too in shock to pay close enough attention. I felt locked in place during the event and was in disbelief of what was happening. My cousin jumped off the bed and we both ran downstairs. When we approached the window again, it had completely gone. Okay, so it's a similar story in some ways, but different in others to the Sam the Sandown Clown. There's two children. They're playing together in a bedroom this time. They hear a noise, a loud, vibrating noise that initiates this experience. They open the curtains and they see this face of light, which seems to be trying to communicate with them. It's talking to them or speaking. They can see the face move, but the voice, the sound that's trying to come through is very muffled and they can't make it out. And furthermore, in addition to not being able to understand this thing, they're frightened. They're locked in place and in shock at seeing this thing. And like with Sam the Sandown Clown, it peters out. The children go downstairs to tell their parents. They come back up and they don't see anything in the window when they get back. Okay, so it follows a similar kind of narrative structure and it contains very similar thematic elements. And I'll just end with one more very strange monster who kind of resists neat definition and classification. Jeff the Talking Mongoose. This was on the Isle of Man this time, another of the islands around Britain, in the 1930s and 40s. And basically, there was a house with a family that lived in it that was the locus of sort of an outbreak of a standard kind of poltergeist activity. All sorts of strange things were happening. Objects were moving around, stones were being thrown, and all of that kind of stuff. And after some investigation, the family identified the source of all of this activity as this mongoose called Jeff. This is how they described him. He's light yellow in color, long bushy tail, which is also light yellow, and the tail has a black or brown tuft of hair at the extreme end. And there are also, we think, 2 or 3 tufts of this brown or black hair on his back. His front feet resemble the human hand, and he appears to have 3 or 4 fingers and a thumb. So he is a monster in the sense of being like a chimera. He has parts of him that are human, like these small human hands, and other parts that are animal-like, well, his mongoose body. And he also can talk, and he would have conversations with um, the family, and they were often kind of contradictory or almost riddle-like kind of conversations. And we know riddles go back with monsters right back to the Sphinx, don't we? And he says, anyway, they ask him what he is, and sometimes he says he's a nature spirit. Sometimes he says he's an extra special mongoose who's learned to talk. And other times he says, I'm a freak. I have hands and I have feet. And if you saw me, you'd faint. You'd be petrified, mummified, turned into a stone or a pillar of salt. Okay, so he talks in these strange, riddle-like ways, and trying to get any kind of accurate, real meaning out of him proved to be very difficult. Okay, so again, these themes emerge. And like with the other stories, there's a period of activity. This one occurred over a number of years, but it eventually fizzles out and there's no resolution to it. So we seem to be dealing with a huge kind of spectrum of different kinds of entities that people might encounter. So the next thing I want to talk about briefly is alien intelligence. Okay, this is a great quote from Stuart Holroyd because we might want to dismiss these strange entities straight out of hand because they're so strange and bizarre, they exceed our boggle threshold. But perhaps there's a reason that we might want to take them at least a little bit more seriously. So this was Stuart Holroyd in the 1970s. He said, we should make a distinction between alien intelligence and intelligent aliens. That alien intelligence exists is indisputable. So, we can look out at the world and we can see plant intelligence, animal intelligence, and we know that that exists. And it goes on, and although whether intelligent aliens exist or not in some other part of the cosmos, so extraterrestrials or Sam the Sandown Clown is another question, the demonstrable existence of such intelligence, plant and animal intelligence, at least opens one's mind to the idea of the existence of intelligent aliens. So what I'm going to talk about now is the possibility that these entities might actually fit into a broader kind of scheme of intelligence and consciousness in nature that goes beyond the human. And this is Holroyd's little conclusion here that there may be persons that are not human, so non-human animals, plant persons that are not physical, perhaps spirits or interdimensional beings or whatever, and then that are not terrestrial. So there may be beings or persons or consciousnesses that have evolved in other parts of the cosmos as well. So there are many possibilities when it comes to consciousness. Can these unbelievable beings perhaps find a place in this expanded view of consciousness? In 2012, a group of scientists published the Cambridge Declaration on Consciousness, and this was the first time when consciousness really was publicly acknowledged to exist really beyond human beings in non-human animals. It's amazing that it took until 2012 to get to this position. It said the absence of a neocortex does not appear to preclude an organism from experiencing affective states, so moods and emotions. Convergent evidence indicates that non-human animals have the neuroanatomical, neurochemical, and neurophysiological substrates of conscious states, along with the capacity to exhibit intentional behaviors. Consequently, the weight of evidence indicates that humans are not unique in possessing the neurological substrates that generate consciousness. Non-human animals, including all mammals and birds and many other creatures, including octopuses, also possess these neurological substrates. Because they're saying that there are other animals that have consciousness similar to ours, even though they don't have the same neuroanatomical structure that we do. And we're also finding evidence of these, of other forms of intelligence and consciousness and awareness in creatures that have very different neuroanatomical structures, even to octopuses and other kinds of animals. Jeremy Narby points out when we look to see intelligence in nature, we tend to use human concepts, things that humans do, and try to find examples of that in nature. You know, we used to say that humans were defined by our capacity to solve problems, to use tools, to have symbolic thought and culture and all of these kind of things. But increasingly, the research and the evidence is showing that these are not unique human traits and that these occur across all number of different species, even in species that are very far removed from us on the phylogenetic tree. So, for example, there's a whole new body of research on plant neurobiology, which is interesting because plants don't have neurons or brains in the same way that we humans do and other animals might. Nevertheless, a compelling body of research shows that higher order plants really are intelligent, able to receive signals from the environment, process information, and devise solutions adapted to their own survival. More recently, they found some research has found evidence for something that might be akin to language in mushrooms. Okay, the use of words to communicate or packets of information akin to words. Tool use used to be seen as a hallmark of human beings. You know, we'd look back in the archaeological record to find when humans first started using tools and say that's the point when human beings emerged. But we've now observed tool use amongst fish, cephalopods, octopuses and squids, all sorts of different kinds of mammals, crabs even, urchins, and possibly even gastropods using tools. So obviously these are not purely human traits. And more importantly, this is not genetic information. Um, Tool use is not passed on to genes, it's something that can be taught and learned. So it also suggests the existence of these non-human cultures. This is a relatively recent field, but there is increasing evidence of learned cultures in all sorts of non-human species, including species of birds, one or two whales, species of fish as well. Okay, so bats, if there is this whole world of different kinds of minds, different kinds of consciousness that are beyond the human, then when we have things like biodiversity loss, we're not just losing biological mass, physical stuff, but we're also using all of these cultural models, ways of understanding the world, different kinds of non-human emotions and things like that as well. So given the fact that we have all of this stuff, it's not entirely impossible that we might also have forms of mind that are very bizarre and strange might emerge. Things that we might refer to as monsters that are not animals or plants in the conventional sense. And this is where I want to get into the last part of this talk now, the issue of communication. So we have these different minds then. How do human and non-human minds communicate with each other? Communication seems to be an important part of many different kinds of paranormal, extraordinary, religious, and anomalous experiences. In fact, they're often about communication, or they are communications in themselves. So we can think of things like telepathy, for example, mind-to-mind communication, or experiences of crisis apparitions when people see a loved one who's in distress or something like that, and then they feel they need to go and help them. It's also a feature of these more high strangeness experiences. So like we've seen with Sam the Sandown Clown or the face in the window or encounters with aliens and monsters, there is always some form of communication going on there. Okay, so the tape recorder, the face in the window. And this reminds us again of Jeffrey Beal's idea that the monstrum was a message that breaks into this world from the realm of the divine. But when we look at these cases in more detail, we see that meaningful communication is often failed or incomplete or is only partial. Or there are factors that influence the way that the message is kind of received. So remember the muffled voice of the face in the window, or the garbled grammar of Sam the Sandown Clown. So this seems to be an important part of it. And one of the ways that I've been thinking about this is through the lens of something that's called meta-communication. This is something I first encountered when I was doing my PhD research with mediums and spirits at the Bristol Spirit Lodge. I became interested in the way that mediums' bodies were used to express spirits. And I encountered this concept of meta-communication in the writing of anthropologist Nurit Bird-David. She was writing about these Nayaka indigenous people in southern India who practice a form of spirit possession. And they incorporate in their bodies these Devara spirits. She says the Devara evoked often improvise on the same repetitive phrases. The saying, the voicing, the gesturing are important. These principal aspects of their behavior are, in Bateson's terms, of Gregory Bateson's terms, meta-communication, namely communicating that Devara are communicating, because the Devara were present as they move, talk, make gestures, etc. They are present as they communicate and socially interact. So what she's saying is that the gestures that the mediums make are not pure communication, but rather they are expressing the fact that a spirit is attempting to communicate. Okay, so they're not communication, they're kind of a step before that. They're showing that a communication is being initiated. The communications then that often take place during these high strangeness experiences that we've been talking about, like with Sam the Sandown Clown, might be more like a form of meta-communication. Okay, communicating that communicating is taking place, and the message is actually lost kind of in translation. This might be explained by something called the incommensurability problem. This is the idea that we have two different forms of mind or two different forms of intelligence, that they might actually be incommensurable with each other, that they might be incompatible in some ways, that we would never be able to understand the concepts or the worldview or the sensations or perspectives of another form of consciousness very different to our own. This idea comes from the search for extraterrestrial intelligence, SETI, and the work of the computer scientist Jacques Vallée. They say at the core of the incommensurability problem is the view that no intelligent species can understand reality without making certain methodological choices, and that these choices may vary from civilization to civilization. If ETs and extraterrestrial aerial phenomena entities have different biologies and live in considerably different environments from humans, they may well have different goals for their science and radically different criteria for evaluating the success of their sciences. Their explanatory mechanisms, their predictive concerns, their modes of control over nature might all be very different, and their means of formulating models of reality should be expected to differ drastically from ours. So this is talking about if we met another civilization, our sciences and things would be very incompatible. But even if we encountered another consciousness on a one-to-one kind of basis, our perspectives might be very difficult. And the best that might be able to be achieved is a form of meta-communication, trying to communicate the fact that we're trying to communicate. And any kind of real knowledge or understanding is lost kind of in that. So these experiences, like I've been saying, they peter out and they don't resolve, and they remain mysteries. So these are my conclusions. We might be dealing with this spectrum of specters, a spectral spectrum. Human beings have reported throughout history and across time all sorts of different encounters with different forms of mind, from humans, encountering other human beings and other animals, all the way through to monsters and these other kinds of unbelievable entities. And I'm interested in a way of whether these different kinds of minds can all be brought together into a bigger picture of consciousness that expands and is inclusive. Because the evidence in science and from biology and these things suggests that consciousness, intelligence, culture, and these kinds of things are much more widely distributed throughout the natural world than we've often wanted to admit. We often wanted to think it was a very human thing, but actually it's much broader than that. And within all of this, communication is the central theme, or the attempt at communication between different, or across the chasm between different kinds of minds and intelligence. And this relates back to the idea that we talked about at the very beginning of the monster as a message or as a communication between the world of the divine and the world of human beings. So that's my talk. Thank you very much. If you have any questions, please feel free to get in touch. Thank you.